Page 332, Part 24. A healthy thinking and feeling certainly counts as being among the greatest of the gifts that the human being can create and give himself or herself, because that deals with a state of consciousness upon which the prosperity or adversity of the human being is dependent. Once a healthy thinking and feeling has really been created, then a certainty has also been created for the human being, from which it emerges that nothing which arises can really disturb and be disadvantageous. And it is also this certainty which spurs on a constant forward progress and the striving for that which is higher, because in the certainty, the success, which is eventually contained in forward progress and striving, can already be seen. But certainty is created from the attitude of one's consciousness, indeed by the acquisition from an actual knowledge of a decisive conviction which becomes one's firm attitude, and with that, one's firm opinion and certainty. Therefore, in this world there is basically only one single effective certainty, indeed that of one's identification with the one and only reality which is possible for the human being. The knowledge and wisdom of one's own consciousness, which has been the human being's power, might, and refuge since time immemorial, and will also remain so for all future time. All the human being's becoming and passing emerges from his or her own consciousness, and indeed regarding all that which he or she is able to devise, evaluate, and bring to fruition through the might of his or her thoughts. By means of his or her consciousness, and the ideas which are thereby conceived and transformed into ideals and imaginations and so forth, and by means of the further logic of his or her thoughts, the human being is master of all the becoming and passing of all those things for which the human being himself or herself is responsible in every regard. Wise human beings rely on neutral, positive, equalized knowledge, and on the wisdom which results from it, because they thereby not only form their lives correctly, in a healthy manner, and evolutively, in a form based on the creational laws, rather through their thoughts, which are directed in the same way, they also contribute everything necessary for keeping the psyche healthy. And if the psyche is healthy, then that also has an effect on the entire body, because healthy thoughts and feelings, and with that also a healthy psyche, also promotes one's physical health, which does not mean, however, that the entire health of the human being is only dependent upon his or her psyche, because, truthfully, there are also many illness factors which are not associated with the psyche. Nevertheless, however, a healthy psyche determines very much in regard to being healthy and being sick, as was already explained earlier. Right thoughts and right feelings are therefore able to promote health across the board, while in certain cases, wrong thoughts have an encouraging effect on illnesses and can promote them. And exactly in this regard, there are many human beings who tend and nurture illness-related thoughts and allow them to stream out of their consciousness directly into their bodies. Anxieties can thereby have just as much effect as can a lack of courage or simply a bad mood, and so forth. Certainly, one of the worst sources of that is unsatisfaction of every kind, as well as constant vexation. These are two factors which, sooner or later, really make the human being sick, and indeed, not only in a purely psychical form, rather also in a psychosomatic form, and thus, thereby, in a psychically, physically conditioned form. Were there no vexation and no anxiety in the consciousness, and thereby also in the thoughts, then all the hospitals worldwide would be very much less full than they are now, whereby the majority of all those made sick by psychosomatic factors, however, is to be found in the so-called civilized and industrialized world. However, this is no wonder, because when the entire daily chase for wages, wealth, and enjoyment and so forth is considered, as well as interpersonal relationships, which are becoming increasingly crass, and the indifference from one human being to another and so forth, then the wonder becomes recognizable misery. Vexation can be extraordinarily varied, but it often emerges from disturbances of an interpersonal nature or of a nature which purely relates to human behavior. For example, when a human being's sense of self is injured by another. The injury calls forth thoughts which range in a palette extending from being enraged, morose, hurt, besieged, and sad, to being miserable, tormented, worried, sorrowful, afflicted, and wounded, and so forth. An injury to one's self, to one's sense of self, automatically calls forth thoughts which are of the nature just named, and consequently also creates the same kind of feelings, through which, in turn, the state of the psyche is determined. If thoughts of having been injured are then nurtured, or if they are talked about, then the thoughts newly create feelings of pain, as it was felt at just the point in time when the injury occurred. And if the injury is not processed and neutralized, then it continues to create new thoughts and feelings of pain, which always continues on in this form, and indeed, every time the vexation about the injury causes the thoughts to rotate. If this repeats itself several times, then the injury, along with the pain, very quickly becomes embedded in the subconsciousness, whereby a wound is made which is no longer able to heal itself. This wound is then the point which influences one's entire well-being in a negative, unhealthy form, which causes illness and throttles the human being's healthy, neutral, positive, equalized thinking and his or her feelings until he or she sinks into hopelessness. Once made, the wound is able to carry over the effect to the body if the psyche is not immediately allowed to work to advantage as a result of a healthy might of the thoughts, and as a result of the entire necessary psychotherapeutic process in a form of one's own, or in a form provided by a third party. And if the effect has an impact on the body, then one of the many psychosomatic illnesses will certainly develop, which, along with the psyche, also draws the body into the negative effects, as the saying goes. And the origin of all of it lies in the consciousness with its thoughts, which create feelings of negativity by means of their might, and through this kind of influencing of the psyche, they cause an internal hell for the thereby harmed human being, quite according to the saying which states that hell is not a place, rather it is an inner state of the human being. Therefore the price the human being pays for his or her vexation can be extraordinarily high, and he or she is only able to heal when, by means of a neutral, positive, equalized thinking, he or she frees himself or herself from his or her vexation, and thereby also from his or her wrong, unhealthy, and illness-causing thoughts and feelings. To behave correctly, the human being should not allow vexation to rise up at all in him or her. Rather, he or she should stop it before it forms or can become active. So, if someone is injured in his or her feelings for himself or herself, then this injury must be immediately countered with a logical remedy. That is to say, with a medicine which can solely consist of a generous attitude of understanding and forbearance for that person who is inflicting injury. This stance calms one's own consciousness and thereby also one's own thoughts, and prevents one's feelings from succumbing to Ausartung and correspondingly harming the psyche. In this way, right from the start, one already avoids it having to come to an injury at all, and avoids a wound being able to be made in the psyche, as well as in the subconsciousness. because when a thorn is broken off at its point before it is able to penetrate, then no injury can arise, which can become infected and become chronic suffering. If injurious attacks on one's sense of self and everything connected with that nevertheless result in such a form that vexation begins to show, then a self-control must be exercised over those emotions one has, and over other significant impulsations which are responsible for the vexation being able to arise at all. But that is not always easy, or it is mostly really quite difficult. But with sufficiently strong self-discipline, one can absolutely do it, and it is absolutely successful. This is practically the most effective wise to prevent the thorn from penetrating further and to neutralize its already released poison. Furthermore, the human being should never be resentful, because that harms the development of his or her own inner nature, and with that the personality. Human beings with a healthy, neutral, positive, equalized consciousness and thinking are therefore not resentful towards any human being on account of any errors, bad behavior and words, and so forth. Indeed, not the least of their reasons is that they do not want to create or repeat any vexation in themselves. To many human beings it appears very strange that, when they direct their consciousness and their thoughts in a neutral, positive, equalized kind, negating and negative and even bad and evil thoughts, which have been dammed up for years, simply vanish. And so, these results of the change of thoughts and change of attitude often appear to them to be almost like a wonder. However, these human beings actually only call such an occurrence wondrous because, up until that point, they have not known, understood, and therefore also not followed the creational laws. Along with vexation, which the human being, himself or herself, always unnecessarily and nonsensically causes, because he or she does not understand how to control his or her emotions and thoughts, the factor of Selbstleid, or feeling sorry for oneself, also plays a weighty role in his or her life. Selbstleid is a term which is better known in common parlance as Selbstmitleid, or self-pity, and says that a human being feels sorry for himself or herself because he or she directs himself or herself at that by means of his or her thoughts, and thereby also his or her feelings, and naturally in this form also influences his or her psyche, in which an impulsation of self-sorrow is created. Therefore, a process comes to light here, which, in a further form, is also to be found in pity, whereby one participates in the suffering of fellow human beings or animals, when the thoughts and the feelings directed the same way are directed at the fellow human beings or animals. This is therefore a process which is of an unhealthy, sick nature, and which arises from a misunderstanding of the obligation in regard to one's neighbor or another creature, an obligation which is based in the law that the human being jointly lives with his or her neighbor and the other creatures, and should provide assistance in regard to how they conduct and maintain their lives and so forth. However, this cannot happen through the human being loading suffering upon himself or herself through a pity, which likewise brings him or her into a miserable, unhealthy situation, which is hostile to life. Rather, it can only happen through him or her sympathetically perceiving the suffering of the neighbor or the other creature, and from that, granting his or her help to his or her neighbor or to the other creature in a right and kind wise. Therefore, in any case, it is required that one has feelings for the neighbor or for the other creature, however, no pity. Pity arises through uncontrolled emotional impulsations, feelings for others, however, through controlled thoughts and feelings. Pity is truthfully therefore quite different to the philosopher's explanations and claims about it. The Selbstleid, or sorrow for self, that is to say, Selbstmitleid, or self-pity, as a result of which the human being feels suffering in himself or herself, shows in its entire range many and, in itself, various forms. One, for example, is that the human being feels sorry for himself or herself, that is to say, has pity for himself or herself, if something or other happens to him or her which injures him or her or burdens him or her, and so forth, in terms of his or her emotions or thoughts-feelings. For example, this can be a financial loss, an accident or an illness, a failed action, an affliction, or some other thing which affects the human being. So, if something happens to a human being, or if he or she is marked with a congenital illness, or with other things which fall outside of the health-related or material norm and so forth, then the human being who is without intelligence, knowledge, and rationality tends to impose a sorrow for self on himself or herself, and asks why he or she of all people, or why his or her neighbor has fallen prey to the terrible things, or to the bad luck, and so forth. But exactly such stupid questions as, quote, "Why me of all people?" or, quote, "Why does that have to happen to me/us, or him or her, of all people?" are more profound and unrighteous than they first appear. In fact, it is more than just a stupid figure of speech, because in truth, behind such unconsidered expressions is the sense, quote, "If that which happened had happened to someone else, then it would be a different matter, and I would not care." But this is truthfully an inhumane way to think, because one should not wish either a small, a middle-sized, or a big illness with which one is afflicted, or with which the next human being is afflicted, onto a neighbor, and certainly not even onto the most terrible and bad human being who has succumbed to the most negative Ausartung. Thinking in a sorrow for self form, that is to say, one of self-pity, is therefore namely not only hostile in regard to oneself, rather it is hostile in regard to one's neighbor. Therefore it is never appropriate, in lack of intelligence, to be self-sorrowful, that is to say, self-pitying, in the occurrence of bad luck which has happened to oneself or to one's neighbor. An affliction, tribulation, harm, or disaster, a tragedy, an accident, or an illness, and so forth, and thereby to raise the hidden unconscious question, quote, "Why did the terrible things happen to me and not to others?" If situations therefore arise which are in some wise loaded with harm, then rummaging around in things concerning this is completely senseless and devolutive, because everything creative and constructive, and with that also one's neutral, positive, equalized thinking, is thereby fundamentally impaired, or it is even destroyed. If the given facts are not accepted, the human being cannot cope in regard to the illness, or bad luck, or other negative circumstance, and so forth, which has happened to him or her. Consequently, the given situation becomes a burden, and triggers Selbstleid, or sorrow for self, that is to say, self-pity, which in every form always leads to negation and to unfairness, and finally, through the wrong negative thoughts, demolishes the feelings, and thereby also the psyche, which then in turn influences the thoughts, and these in turn influence the feelings, and so on and so forth. Number 1. For the human being, neutral, positive, equalized thoughts are factors in both evolutive as well as health-related regard, which are the equivalent of medicine which is able to heal an illness. Number 2. The real inner peace, which is deeply embedded in the consciousness, does not only have a calming effect on the thoughts and feelings, rather also on the nerves, because peace is also something which is the equivalent of a medicine for the human being. Number 3. It is necessary for the human being to live progressively in his or her consciousness. Consequently, the thoughts which arise from that must be nourished daily and at all times with striving for that which is higher. Number 4. It is necessary to convince oneself again and again that the human being, himself or herself, is master of the way he or she conducts his or her life, and master of the forming of his or her personality, character, and morality, and so forth, because it is only through this conscious knowledge that the human being is able to be creative and constructive with himself or herself. Number 5. The human being must use the power of his or her will in order to use the evolutive, creative, and constructive power of his or her consciousness, and thereby also the might of his or her thoughts, according to the progressive degree of his or her cognition, knowledge, and the lived practical experience, as well as according to his or her achieved wisdom. Number 6. The human being must never forget that he, himself, or she, herself, determines whether his or her consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and psyche, and to a large extent also his or her body, are made healthy or sick, and indeed through the very might of his or her thoughts, the form of which he or she always determines himself or herself. And number 7. The astounding limitlessness of the power and might of the consciousness and of the thoughts must always be recognized and used in order to evolutively form one's own life, as well as that of one's fellow human beings, all other kinds of creatures, and the entire environment, according to the creational recommendation of striving for that which is higher.